Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
I'm Nathan Kiker. Welcome to our podcast, Clearer Than Truth. I'm glad to be joined by my co-host, George Bogdan.
The wisdom of former Secretary of State Dean Acheson inspires our episodes. We emphasize clarity while examining the intricate global issues of today for a diverse audience.
In a world where time is limited, we distill complex ideas, making them not just comprehensible, but in Acheson's words, clearer than truth. Thanks for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Today is Wednesday, October 16th, and our guest today is Drew Petrimoulx. Drew is a journalist and the founder of Framed Up Productions, a documentary filmmaking company. Before we dive into our interview, let's take a look at the news of the day. In Georgia, a new poll has former President Donald Trump ahead of Vice President Kamala Harris by 7 points, and was shaping up to be one of the marquee battles in this election. Also in Georgia, former President Jimmy Carter voted early for Kamala Harris, just days after his 100th birthday. In a significant ruling, the Nebraska Supreme Court ordered the resumption of voter registration for individuals with felony convictions. And conflict in the Middle East continues to escalate as Israel has readied a plan to respond to this month's attack by Iran. Already, the number of Israeli attacks in Lebanon has passed 10,000. With that, let's jump into our interview. Drew, thanks for joining us.
Appreciate you guys having me on. I'm excited for this.
Yeah, of course. So you are spending a lot of time covering this year's elections. What trends are you seeing here in D.C. when covering the presidential race? Let's start there.
I think it's interesting, especially right now. It's like both candidates have this inclination to do non-traditional media. So it's like both candidates are just making the rounds on all these big podcasts. Actually, some even that aren't that big. So I think that traditional media, and I don't know that I really count as that now because I have a show on YouTube. So I'm a little bit non-traditional, even though most of my journalism these days is through The Hill, which is kind of, a classic DC publication, even though their YouTube channel and stuff like that is pretty new. So, yeah, I think, a lot of what I've been doing lately is listening to the candidates appear on these long form podcasts on double speed so I can get through them because there's so many of them now. But that's been a large part of like how I'm analyzing this election is watching the candidates appear in on the Call Her Daddy podcast or Bussin' with the Boys, which are not journalists interviewing them. So some of them have varying degrees of abilities and interests, and I think that shows. But it's a different election than we've ever seen before. And there's a little bit of like flooding the zone. I think that both candidates, Trump has been doing this throughout the campaign, but now I think Harris is really in the last final weeks trying to flood the zone and reach non-traditional voters, because I think they both think that the people that follow this and live and breathe it made up their minds a long time ago.
Do you buy the idea that Vice President Harris's campaign is sort of bubble wrapping her, so to speak, trying to avoid, doing anything that would negatively impact her campaign, but not necessarily putting herself out there as much as other candidates in the past have? Or is that just kind of a narrative within a narrative?
I think they were initially, and I think that was the inclination to try to get their ducks in a row. They had so many things I imagined to do before that was the priority. And I think there's a tendency among journalists and among people that live and breathe this all day, every day, to think like, what is she waiting for? Like, we're getting to the end of this. It's almost over. But in reality, a lot of voters are just now starting to pay attention. This is when people get interested. October is when the quote unquote October surprise usually happens, something that can dramatically change the trajectory of the race. So for us, me included, that have all been thinking, what the heck is she doing? How is she just being so, like you said, bubble wrap? Why isn't she making appearances? Why isn't she everywhere? For normal people, it might have been too early for them to start digesting that, and they would have had to do it all over again now. So I think whereas you could make that argument a month ago, I think it's pretty hard to make that argument now, considering, she's going on Fox News like in an hour. So I think that she's doing more and more. And, you might be able to argue that that's because this race is tightened and she might think she's losing. And so she has to take risks that maybe her campaign wasn't inclined to take a month ago when she had momentum. But, I think that accusation can't really be made now. And, I was actually watching the Charlemagne the God interview today, and she was challenged on there, pretty strongly. Charlemagne is a Harris supporter, but he was letting people come on and ask questions. And she was asked, pretty pointed questions by both Charlemagne and her guests. So I think to a certain extent, the bubble wrap has been taken off. The campaign realizes that this is razor thin. Either candidate can win right now. And they have to put her everywhere and take their lumps as they may come, which they are coming. She's making mistakes for sure.
Where do you anticipate Trump spending his final month when it comes to talking to the media? It's hard to imagine there are people out there who don't know who he is or have an opinion on him. How does he find new voters through traditional and new media?
I don't think for either campaign there's a secret stash of voters that they are waiting to appeal to. I mean, there are very few voters that are out there, but I don't think there's a secret sauce. It's going to be about grinding away and sending as many people knocking on doors, because literally every vote could count. But like you said, people mostly have their minds made up. I think one of the big things that everybody's watching for is like what happens with Joe Rogan. Does Kamala Harris is reportedly making a play to appear on the show. I would not imagine that he would do one and not the other. So to me, it would either be both or none. And so, yeah, I'd be really interested to see if she makes a play for them. One thing I do think you saw today, Trump did a town hall with women voters with Harris Faulkner on Fox News. I think that with her making this play to go on Joe Rogan, both sides are relatively weaker with the opposite sex. And I think that you'll see some efforts from both sides to try to see if they can peel off voters of the opposite sex.
President Clinton famously in '92 went on Arsenio Hall's show and, played Heartbreak Hotel on his saxophone. And there was this kind of deep gasp of scandal among the, political elites of the time. Do you think that, it's always within kind of the repertoire of a national campaign to do this kind of provocative new media, or is this fundamentally new in a way that we haven't ever seen?
I think Bill Clinton and Barack Obama are unique political talents that you can almost put anywhere and they can make people feel good about it. With candidates like Mitt Romney, with candidates like Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Donald Trump, they're not that. I don't think that they're elite political communicators the way that Clinton and Obama are. So you would necessarily want to be a little bit more guarded with the appearances that they make. Trump less so, just because people are used to seeing him say and do outlandish things, and at this point they don't make as big of an impact on an individual basis, whereas Harris is a more guarded figure, so any one instance of her kind of stepping completely out and possibly making a misstep would be amplified. That being said, if she were to go on Joe Rogan, that's a pretty big cross-cultural moment that is politically risky, and I think on a similar level, while not the same, to Clinton's famous appearance on the Arsenio Hall show.
It kind of, to piggyback on what I mentioned a minute ago, it seems as if even if you wanted to, you couldn't tune this election out. You can't tune any election out. It's constantly really loud. It's like being at a rock concert, no matter what. What do voters actually care about? Who tunes in to actually pay attention? Like when you're on Call Her Daddy or any of these other shows, how do you actually get the attention of someone who, let's say, is a 26-year-old single woman voter? Like, what can you say? What can you do if you are Kamala Harris or Donald Trump to break through just the noise?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the reason why she went on the Call Her Daddy show is to try to appeal to pro-choice women, especially in swing states. So she's trying to find the 26-year-old woman who's not completely politically engaged, doesn't have sharp opinions and identify reflexively with one of the two parties, maybe came from a household where politics wasn't discussed frequently, but does feel strongly about that issue. For Trump, I think it's similar, but more along the lines of the economic issues. I think both the economy and the choice issue is something that people just have such strong emotions about. One, because it's like a freedom issue, and many women and men feel laws restricting abortion rights are an affront to personal freedom and an intrusion of government, where the economy, for people especially that live paycheck to paycheck or don't have a big savings account, like they see that as an issue that cuts through all the other BS. And so, if the price of groceries and the price of gas truly affects you, then that's an emotional issue, I think, on the level of the choice issue. And so they're both trying to find those voters. And because they've blanketed the airways and spent a gajillion dollars on ads and they've done every show, they're just out there spending the time the best that they can. I mean, I asked a question today on my show. Trump is going to do an appearance at a McDonald's in Philly on Sunday. The other day, he just basically danced in front of his supporters for 30 minutes. It's almost like, is he just running out of things to do? I mean, they've spent ungodly amounts of money. Harris raised $1 billion. He's going to raise and spend $1 billion. Trump has basically been running a campaign for 2 straight years. You kind of run out of things to do that can help your campaign. So maybe, is it that big of a deal if we just sit up here and dance and then take up some time? It's hard to know, I think, inside the campaigns, like what more can we actually do other than what we've been doing, which is you crisscross the battleground states and do rallies.
Well, that actually comes to an interesting question. Let's say you're running for governor, Senate, or in Congress. Who's going to actually notice for these reasons you're talking about? Trump has been running for 9 consecutive years constantly. She's been running now for 2.5 months, full steam ahead. Is there any way as a down ballot candidate to break through right now, or does it even matter? Do you even need, in a silly way, these congressional, Senate, and gubernatorial campaigns?
Well, I think honestly one of the more interesting aspects of this cycle has been the relative success of Democratic Senate candidates in swing states, like Gallego in Arizona. You have Bob Casey in Pennsylvania, have been consistently running ahead of the Democratic presidential candidate. They were running ahead of Biden, and they're running ahead of Harris now. And that's honestly, I'm more interested to see what happens with that and the ballot initiatives, because you have them, kind of the liberal side of the ballot initiatives, running ahead of the Democratic presidential candidate as well. So I think of the last 69 Senate races, they've all voted in congruence with the presidential race, except for one. And it's like, I don't know, could that happen 3 times? Because the Senate race in Wisconsin is kind of trending that way too. So you have like 3 states where the Democrats are running way ahead of the president. So it's either something weird is happening here. They're either just better candidates, or the polls are not picking up on something right, or the Republican candidates are uniquely bad, which I think you might be able to make an argument in maybe like Arizona. But I bring that up because it's kind of, I think, to a certain extent, an answer to the question, because there's something that these candidates are doing that's causing this discrepancy that's not being seen in the presidential race. So we're going to have to wait and see like how closely those are tied. I tend to think like those Senate races are going to be more closely tied to the presidential race than the polls are indicating. But, the polls are indicating there's more daylight between them too. So that there's something that's happening in those races that appears to be making a difference.
There's an adage that history is written by the victors, and I've always thought that that's sort of amplified with regard to elections, that the victorious side kind of then has this hand to explain, what led to their victory in the election, and people kind of accept it, right? But I wonder, as the maker of this wonderful documentary, Uncommon Ground, whether you think there's a kind of repeat of some of the dynamics that you captured in that film, that, folks in the Harris campaign may have us believe have sort of, been captured in the past and are no longer relevant. Is there a kind of echoing forward of the same things that brought President Trump to power in 2016 occurring right now, or is it a different dynamic altogether?
Well, I do think that there's a tendency in this country to careen back and forth between polar opposite candidates. It's like you had Bush the cowboy, Obama the academic, Trump the brash businessman, first-time politician, Biden the old salt who's been around forever. And usually incumbents, I think, have had such a big advantage in politics that they usually last 8 years. That didn't happen with Trump. We'll see. Obviously, it didn't happen with Biden. We'll see if his party can hold on to power. But that careening back and forth and kind of always wanting someone new, forgetting what you didn't like about the old guy, and being more fresh in your feelings about what you don't like about the current person, and always wanting change. Like, that's one of the major themes of this race, right? Change. Who's the change candidate? And in this race, the water is a little bit muddy because you have someone who's a part of the administration but not exactly running the show going against somebody who's not in power anymore but was in power. So it's a little bit unique in that sense. But I think insofar as like people are looking for change, you have that dynamic playing out. Obviously in 2016, the immigration issue was huge for Trump, and it's a big issue again now. So I think that if Trump is successful, the inability of the Biden administration to navigate the immigration issue in a way that, is seen by voters as competent is going to be partly to blame.
We've seen a number of events in the last few months that, despite being large in scale and importance, haven't really shifted the race, whether it's continuing violence in the Middle East, Ukraine, the immigration issue, which you're just hitting on. What issues, if any, will actually shift the race in the last 20-ish days at this point?
Well, it depends on what happens. If there is some cataclysmic escalation in the Middle East, apparently there's going to be 100 U.S. troops in Israel manning this equipment that is being used to defend from outside attacks. If something were to, God forbid, something were to happen to them, if there's an escalation that truly kind of reaches more than, I think people realize that there is drama unfolding in the Middle East right now and that people are dying. But if there was something that was seen to draw the U.S. in more concretely, that could change something. Obviously, something terrible like a terrorist attack would change the dynamic. But I think, it's so close. I think that it's going to be a mix of the different things. It's going to be partly on how effective the candidates are able to close in their messaging. I think especially with Harris, I think that she hasn't really, I don't think, grabbed a hold of the issues and really kind of grabbed them by the collar and gave just a really concise and powerful explanation for why she's the better candidate. So I think a lot of it's going to depend on like if she can do that. She's kind of learning on the job. She was, she hasn't been running a campaign for 2 years. She hasn't been making these appearances and having to answer these questions. So I think there are some indications that maybe she's growing on the job a little bit better, but she's going to have to perform. She's going to have to give an A+ performance over these next few weeks. And really, each appearance, you're looking for 100 voters or 50 voters or 10 voters. And can you find them and can you speak to them is going to be the difference of it. As far as the issues, I don't imagine that there's going to be any major movement in the economy that could make a huge difference. On the abortion rights issue, that's kind of set in stone right now. But, we say all that, and there's always an October surprise. So you'd have to think that there's been tons of money poured into opposition research by both sides. And if somebody has something, it's about that time. So Could there be a recording or something like that? I would definitely not be surprised that whatever they have, both sides are going to try to leak out into the media and make it appear to be the October surprise or play up this or that. So I think that there's going to be efforts at that. The question is, like, does it resonate? Does it rise to the level? Are people even susceptible as much to this October surprise as they were in the past, because they've just been inundated with so much over the past year?
I want to look ahead to a potential Trump administration. He, of course, had a very tumultuous relationship with the media in his first term. Do you think he has grown or learned any lessons? And what do you anticipate his approach to be in dealing with the media if he were to win again?
I think the lesson that he will have learned if he wins again is that his approach to the media works. And I don't think that he will have any inclination to do anything differently than he has in the past, which has been relatively combative with the media. He praises the media when he thinks it's advantageous to him, and he criticizes when he doesn't. So yeah, I would expect and journalists and media figures are going to have every incentive to, hold him to account and investigate his administration. There's the eyes of the world will be on every move that he makes, and there will be lots of interest and ink to be spilled over the inner workings of the Trump administration. Yeah, the interesting thing is going to be he had a notoriously leaky first administration. He had kind of all these figures in his administration that were more traditional Republican figures, had served in elected office before, were members of foreign policy establishment. A lot of those figures have been driven out of Trump's orbit right now. So, it will be interesting to see with a new group of people that he would be bringing in, if they would be maybe more leak proof and would be able to kind of avoid some of the internal turmoil that we saw kind of was a staple of the first Trump administration. He's going to probably bring more people that he are, loyal to him, owe their careers to him, are more in line with his worldview than he did in the first administration, where he was kind of bringing in the traditional Republican folks that you would expect any Republican to bring into the administration.
Right. I mean, I sometimes try to remind folks that it might be part of, the wisdom of his toolbox to have this constant antagonism, in part because it gets people's attention. But also, I mean, I remember the Washington before Trump, and I remember, magazines like the Weekly Standard, which were just, really advancing a cohesive view on foreign policy that is not to say out of fashion now, but completely, sidelined, right? And so, you look around Washington now, and there's a whole constellation of institutions that are entirely dedicated to elaborating his view. The America First Policy Institute is just, something you could never have imagined before his first term. So I think that that's definitely on the money, that we're going to have both a different Washington and a different establishment, were he to have a second term. And so it would be curious to see how that turns out. But tough to predict these things. So
yeah, and I mean, I think the kind of isolationist populist wing of really it's existed in both parties, has been a thing in Washington, and it's been a part of the political discourse. But the level of power that it will have achieved in a second Trump term, I think, is unprecedented, and would be very interesting to see how much of that he can follow through with. Because the Lindsey Grahams of the world still have a relationship with him, so he's going to have kind of more traditional Republican figures that will still have his ear, and I'm sure will be lobbying him to keep up American commitments when it comes to, foreign relationships and foreign aid in line with what has been done in the past. And yeah, there will be that too.
Yeah. In many ways, it could be similar to the Globe and Andrew Jackson in like the 1820s, his own sort of personal publication. Drew, I want to thank you for taking the time, and I don't want to monopolize too much of your time. I know you're very busy, but for our listeners, where can they find your work?
So on the Hills YouTube channel, my show is called The Daily Debrief. So we do the show 3 times a week. You can watch all that there. On TikTok and YouTube and Instagram, I'm at Drew Petrimoulx. I have my own podcast called The World and Stuff Podcast. So you can find that on Spotify and on YouTube and Apple and all the podcast catchers. So yeah, follow me on social media, interact with me, tell me where you disagree.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for the time. Really appreciate it, and hopefully we can do it again soon. Thanks again for joining us for this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Be sure to share with your friends and tune in next time.